Welcome to Two Guys on a Porch. Stick with us today, and we're going to find out, can Scotch come from India? And we're going to solve the immigration crisis in the country.
Today is going to be a short episode. Not. Welcome to Two Guys on the Porch. I'm Jason. This is Bradford. And as always, here with the most popular person on the cast, Kimber, my hunting dog. You know, she's the most popular one on the show, yet she says the least. What does that mean, Bradford?
I was going to say, how do you know she's the most popular?
This is common knowledge.
Well, you may have just answered that because she does say the least. I think that may do us in.
Yeah, there's a correlation.
No doubt. Welcome to Two Guys on a Porch today, and we've got some exciting whiskey to taste. And notice I didn't say bourbon. We had to quit drinking bourbon after one of our previous episodes, so we had to move on to other things. So
we're expanding our horizons.
Yes, we did a Macallan Scotch episode, which was really good. But today we're going to look at some Indian whiskey, the largest producer of whiskey in the world, and it fits really well with our topic, which is immigration. Which couldn't be any more controversial in today's political climate.
Everybody has an opinion on that. But go back to India whiskey. Wow, that's not common knowledge. You know, the fact that it produces more than anybody else in the world. And if you look at the list of the top 10 producers, I think Johnny Walker and Macallan are up there, but all the other ones are Indian whiskeys.
Well, yeah, you were the one who told me that India was the world's largest producer. I didn't know that. I had Indian whiskey at that point. Now, the single most popular whiskey in the world is Jim Beam. And that has banted back and forth between Jim Beam and Jack Daniels. Jack Daniels is probably the most recognizable
brand. From a brand, it's the Coca-Cola of bourbons or whiskey, what do you want to say?
But in terms of production, now it is misleading.
Yes,
that India is the largest producer.
Because like immigration, India's definition of whiskey is all inclusive, right? I mean, so it's not whiskey in the strict sense.
Yeah, more than 60% of what they produce has a base of molasses, which would effectively be rum. Some version of rum,
right?
Which is a molasses-based spirit. So that's the majority of what they do. I found interesting the history a little bit of Indian whiskey, which makes perfect sense. I mean, first of all, the country as an independent nation has only existed since 1947, when the UN was established and they were dividing the world into pieces. And India had been a British colony for couple of hundred years by that point, and they gained their independence as a result of all of those negotiations. But because of the presence of the British and British military for decades upon decades, they had been introduced to Scotch. And the oldest distillery that still operates in India is using a copper still that was brought from Scotland in 1820, sometime in the 1820s, and they still use that today to produce whiskey. Now, it's not one of the ones we're tasting today. I'm not sure it's one of the ones that's even available to export.
Right, and so going back to that, the Indian definition of whiskey is just very broad. It's basically any spirit they just call whiskey. Perhaps that's left over from before the British rule, colonization, the British were calling it whiskey, and so they just thought all alcohol was whiskey. And so the grains not being readily available in India, they started to use molasses. And so the Indian definition of that, of whiskey is very loose. It's just basically any alcohol, not just the grain alcohols that we see with whiskeys like Scotch and bourbon.
Yeah, and it's appropriate that we talk about Indian whiskey for a couple of reasons. One, I get to go to India. I went last year. I'm going again in April. So excited about that. Secondarily is in 2022, India became the second largest country of immigrants to the United States. And they had basically never made the list before. And all of a sudden, they have moved from outside of the top 10 into the number 2 spot. Now, since 1980, Mexico has been the number 1 country of immigration to the U.S. So I think, we get to honor our Indian American compatriots by drinking whiskey produced in their country.
And we're going back to an old favorite for cigars, the Padron's 1964s. So nothing new to us there, but it's a favorite of mine.
Yeah, and also honoring another immigrant, Jose Padron, the patriarch of that company, immigrated from Cuba and established his company in Miami in 1964. He was born in 1926, which is another series they offer as well. This, the 1964, was released in 1994 to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the cigar. And if you recall, we had and hope to again the 50th anniversary cigars, which were amazing.
Yeah, they were very good. But this is great. This is it's not cheap, but it's got a good taste to it. Not the sweet taste like you might have on other natural wrappers, but it has a nice smooth feel to it.
Yeah, I don't know if it's intentional or not, but it seems like it's about $1 a year. These are about a $30 stick.
Yeah.
The 50th anniversary were $50 cigars, so I don't know whether that's intentional or not.
I'm sure it is. They're making their change. So we're drinking some Indian whiskeys. Now we talked about Indian whiskeys being made of molasses, but these 3 are more the traditional whiskey methods. They're actually made from grains.
Yeah,
malt,
these would
malted
be
barley.
effectively scotches. You can get Japanese scotches, which are reputed to be, and I've had some, very good because the climate so mirrors Scotland. But in terms of style, yes, what we're drinking is scotch. Now, the climate in India is significantly different. One of their master distillers said that a barrel aged in India for 1 year would be the equivalent of 3 in Scotland. Now, I don't know whether that's true or how much it affects the taste and all of that, but to your point, this process, this style, is much like a scotch. They do typically use a 6-row barley as opposed to the Scottish 2-row. It apparently infuses a little more spice as a result. That would be the only difference.
Yeah, and so barley, your beer growers or beer fermenters out there will be more familiar with this, but all they're talking about there with 2 and 6 rows are just the heads of the barley, just whether you have the kernels coming out there 2 side by side, or the 6 is more of an asymmetrical beefier head. With the 6-row, it absorbs more water. It's harder to dry out, hence. And so there's advantages and disadvantages that. The 6-row will theoretically have more other stuff in there. It'll have more protein and therefore less starch. And that starch is how the sugars are then converted and fermented. Maybe it's spicier, maybe it's not, but certainly harder to use. 6-row is more, or historically has been more, animal feed. It's the 2-row that you see more in the beer drinking. It's a higher quality beer would be a 2-row barley. The challenge with India is it's not conducive to growing barley, and that's why they use molasses. The 6-row is a little more hardier, and so you can grow it, or you might have to import it. Some of these imported their barley from Scotland.
Yeah, if they want that peat flavor in particular, they are importing pre-peated barley. Now, the order in which we're going to taste these is Amrut, and then Paul John, and then Indri, and that's the order in which they were exported from India to the UK and Europe and to the US. So Amrut, let's go ahead and taste this. And these, the proof on these is very typical of Scotch. One of these is 100 proof, so 50% alcohol. That's not crazy, but it's out of the norm for Scotch. The other two are the traditional 86 proof, 43% alcohol, or ABV as they would say.
So the first thing you notice as you look over this is the color. Great difference in color. And as you mentioned, the aging is a lot different in India than it is in Scotland. And you can argue why that is. The temperatures in India are kind of the climate is much warmer than Scotland. It's more comparative to here in the South with bourbons. But what's really different is the humidity in India is a lot less. More humidity in Scotland. Moreover, what that comes out to is you have a lot of evaporation from the barrel. You get like 10 to 12% evaporation in the barrels in India as opposed to a typical 2%. Right. So you can't age it very long. If you do the math, you're in 5 years, you're down to 60% of the barrel. You're just having to have a lot of barrels to produce the same amount. So the heat, like bourbons in the South and the rick houses, that heat in India and lack of humidity causes, or I should say the heat, a lot of temperature changes, and the humidity in India causes a lot of interaction with the barrel, and perhaps that's why the aging is sped up.
Yeah, and these are non-age statements. They estimate they're probably 4 to 5 years old, and like Scotch, has to be 3 years old to be eligible for exportation from the country. But yeah, they estimate that these are 4 to 5 years old. So what did you think? You just tasted that.
Yeah, so it's great. So it very much tastes like a Speyside in that it's not that peaty. You don't taste the dirt. Again, the peat is okay. You get that barley, you get it wet, you let it ferment, and then you dry it out. Peat is how you build a fire. You're drying out your barley, and you throw some peat, which is basically just dirt, vegetation it's dirt that burns. Dirt doesn't typically burn, but it burns poorly. It just smokes, and that smoke comes up as they're drying it out and imbues those characteristics on the barley being dried. So this is a very smooth finish. I don't taste and when I say it's Speyside, I love that. It has some smoke sense, but you're not drinking liquid dirt here. It's got a nice face to it, nice full mouth to it.
What do you think of the nose?
Not much to it.
I agree, but did think it was, pretty floral. It didn't drink like that. And I will say, you're right, characteristically, and I think most Indian Scotches try to emulate the Speyside or Speyside Scotch, more fruit forward. However, and I think this does that, right? And I would say, yeah, this is fine whiskey, right?
Yes, this is very good. If you were putting this up against a blind taste test of other Scotch, I think you would put that right there in there.
Where I think it lacks is balance. It just seems to be a little bit all over the place in terms of what you're tasting, how it finishes. The alcohol can kind of hit you a little suddenly, which for something that low proof shouldn't. You may determine it's a little bit different. So I would certainly not say it's unpleasant.
No, it's very much a full mouth taste, a little bit of an oily finish, and you can taste the alcohol content. It's a little spicier, not a cinnamon spicier, but just a hot spicier. You can taste the alcohol content in there, and the finish is affected by that. You don't have that titanic or ketone aftertaste, but it's a little bit of a burn going down that finish with it. So it's good. I wouldn't put up with Macallan, excuse me, my southern tongue, but it's good.
Yeah, I agree. So, back to the subject of immigration, and we may or may not delve into the current political climate, but let's talk a little bit about the United States as a country. I mean, we're founded by immigrants, people fleeing Europe primarily to establish the American colonies, really to have an opportunity to worship how they wanted to. And that is baked into the Constitution. Now, you've got a number of elected officials, not naming Lauren Boebert by name, who says that separation of church and state is, not in the Constitution. It's from a letter. That is complete bullshit.
Tell me what you really think.
Yeah, read the Constitution. So, and I'm very, very firm on the stance of being a Christian and not being a Christian nationalist. We were not founded as a Christian nation. I do believe, unlike others, that we were founded on Christian principles, primarily. But trust me, I don't want to ever be in a position, because it's, what's the rule of power? He who has the power makes the rules.
Yeah.
I don't want to be in a situation where someone dictates to me that I have to be Hindu or Islam or whatever religion the powers that be are. I want to have freedom from that to worship how I want to. And I think that's certainly an example of Christian charity. But the country, because there were so many Christian immigrants, Puritans, that had a singular view of how things should be, they only wanted white Europeans to immigrate here. And so until 1920, Germany, the UK, Italians, they made up the majority of the folks that immigrated to the U.S. And it was pretty open and welcome to that point. What's interesting is the Jewish population exploded in the latter half of the 19th century. And they came primarily from Europe. But they face, and still do, terrible discrimination. And I've got a great story to tell you. So I grew up in a small town, Sylacauga, Alabama. You're familiar.
Yep.
And a very unique experience. Heavy black population, about 38% black population. And unbeknownst to me, a decent enough Jewish population. So I get out of college. I'm moving to Orlando, Florida. And one of the guys in town, he was a neighbor of mine. He said, older fellow. And he said, oh, you need to go look up my friend Sam Baer. He's from Talladega, which, the racetrack near there, so 20 minutes away.
Yep.
And he said, you need to go look up Sam Baer. He'll take care of you. So I go down there, and well, lo and behold, there's Baer's shoe store right across the street from where I work. And I walk in, and I said, yeah, I'm looking for Sam Baer. Oh, yeah, he's back there. Well, I go back there, and he's sitting up on a shoe shine chair, and kind of holding court in a very literal way, because those chairs are elevated.
Yeah,
and
it's thrown.
And I'm wearing a suit, and I go introduce myself, and all these people are standing around, and he's an older gentleman, and I introduce, hey, I'm Bradford Crowther, and Sidney Goldberg sent me to see you, and oh, you know Sidney? How do you know Sidney? And I said, I'm from Sylacauga, and he said, oh, well, I'm from Talladega, blah blah blah, and he, what? Tell me how you know Sidney. I said, well, we're neighbors. Oh, yeah, well, that's great, blah, blah, blah. Tell me your name again. I said, Bradford Crowther. Crowther. So how do you know Sidney again? Do you know what he's trying to get at?
Yeah, you're not Jewish.
Exactly. So he's making all these connections, and finally, and like, we'd known the Goldbergs for years, right? I'd gone and taken care of Mr. Goldberg when his wife was out of town, make sure somebody was in the house. And finally, he looked at me and went, oh, you're a Gentile. Now, that was fine, but it was a distinguishing, feature that he was trying to figure out. And I guess if you're Jewish, you kind of want to know where you stand with certain people.
Yeah. Their history or their experiences in history have colored them. They've been so discriminated against that you're jaded by that, and who's to blame them for that?
Yeah, and until 1965, immigration was limited to basically white Europeans. And it wasn't until then that Latin America and Asian immigrants basically had the same opportunities to immigrate here that the rest of the world did.
So they came more from a economic standpoint, still come from more of an economic standpoint, maybe from a religious freedom standpoint to a certain degree. But everybody sees the poverty levels in Latin America, South America, and even Asia, that your heart goes out to them. I mean, those are some rough circumstances over there. And so, everybody wants more for their family, opportunity and education. And so you try to get out of Dodge if you can. So
yeah.
Who's to blame them for trying to get over here?
Yeah, and I've got another comment on that. But I think let's taste the middle whiskey that we have.
So now we are going full Scotch here. This, I haven't looked at the bottle, but now we're talking.
Can you smell it?
Yeah. You smell the dirt. We're going full Isla here, Isla style Scotch.
Oh yeah.
This is peat at its strongest, but it's not overwhelming dirt. Some of the Islas are just, or if you're Southern, it's Islay. The Islas are just, man, you're just drinking liquid dirt. This I can handle. This is less smoky, more dirt. On the nose, you smell it coming. It's more of a full mouth encompassing feel. You taste the peat going down. You don't get the burn here. I suspect this is a lesser alcohol volume, but man, they really peat it up.
That peat is strong. Mm-hmm. Now, the Paul John that I had in India was not peated. They have a number of different varieties, but where I bought this, he said, yeah, you really have to try that. It's a fantastic expression of strongly peated whiskey. Now, for those of you looking for a bottle of George Ringo, as opposed to Paul John, this is not based on the Beatles, so we're not looking for the other half. It was founded by a man named Paul H. John, so named it after himself, which, you know, would you have a Hubbard whiskey, Jason?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Sign me up, buddy. Yeah. Who wouldn't? Would you not?
I don't, nobody can say my name anyway, Crowther.
Yeah, well, that would make it a
Bradford
unit.
sounds a little pretentious to begin with.
Well, in all honesty, if I had the opportunity to have my own bourbon, the field's way too competitive for, I think, to get into right now. But I actually wouldn't name it with my name on it. I do some sort of unique name to it. Yeah, it wouldn't be a Jack Daniels. I would name it something else. I wouldn't put my name on it.
You're right, on the nose, man. It just, that strong peat flavor or smell. But gosh, that drink's smooth.
Yeah, so
It's really good if you like peat.
yeah, and I'm so on peat, but between these two here, I actually like the Paul John better.
Me too.
It's a more of a traditional Scotch, but its finish is much better. The alcohol content, let's see what we got here.
I think that may be the one that's 100 proof. Am I right?
Yeah, close to it. It's 46% ABV, so 92 there. And
Yeah, which is the more standard. I think I may have misspoken earlier.
Yeah, so and this is actually Amrut has more alcohol. It's 45% alcohol, or excuse me, 50% alcohol, 100%.
So that's the one that's a little higher. And unfortunately, I think you could taste it.
Yeah,
I didn't think it had enough balance to it overall.
Yeah,
whereas this is
like this reminds me of Johnny Walker Blue Label. It's a Johnny Walker being a blended Scotch.
But it doesn't have near the peat that.
Yeah, this is more peaty. You're right about that, but it has more of a blended taste to it. And I don't know. Forgive me for not being able to accurately describe what that blended taste is like, but it has. This is not a blended. This is a single malt.
Yeah.
But it's way peated and has that traditional Scotch taste to it.
Yeah, I would not hesitate if someone came and said, "Hey, recommend a really good peated whiskey." I would recommend this without hesitation.
Yeah, and I actually might like the peat level in this more than Lefroy, which is your classic Islay peated Scotch.
Yeah. The Lefroy 16 is a smoother offering than their 12-year, which is more standard. But that Lefroy 16-year is also priced to the point that it's out of most people's reach. Yeah. And I don't know why. I mean, it's good, but it's not like, oh my gosh. And by the way, all of these, $80 to $120 a bottle. Scotch is more expensive than bourbon, so you pay a little more for it.
That's surprising because these, as we mentioned already, these haven't been aging. You don't have that inventory on the shelf. To put it on business terms, you don't have stock inventory costs. Trump tariffs, is that what it is? All right. Well.
I'm sure that plays some part in that.
If you look online, it may be more expensive than what we paid, but it's going to be more expensive than your typical bourbon. It's made in India. I guess there's transportation cost. I guess the boats from India cost more than the boats from Scotland.
Which would make a whole lot of sense, frankly. Yeah. So we've had 70 million immigrants since 1965, going back to that part of the discussion. Mexico, so that whole Latin America, since 1980, just dwarfs every other country in terms of immigrants and immigrant population, to the point that if it's not now, it will be in the next decade or two, the largest plurality of population in the United States. More than Caucasian, more than Black, more than Asian, it will be the predominant plurality of the population in the country.
Yeah.
I think that's one reason why, politicians are seeking out those blocks of votes according to those demographic populations.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of conspiracy theories. Who knows how much truth there is to it. Democratic parties think they're going to vote for them. The recent elections, it's been more the Republican Party they've voted for. Don't know, who knows? That's reading tea leaves how they come. But looking at the bigger picture, my heart goes out to them. I think if I put myself in their position, absolutely, I would walk 500 miles or whatever it is to get my family to a better position. I often wonder, why do we have immigration limitations? I mean, if you want to come and you can get here, great, more power to you. I think you need to.
Are you an open the borders kind of a
No,
believer?
you got to have a screen. No, not necessarily. I mean, because you got to have a screening process. It can't be like when the big Cuban migration came in. Basically, supposedly, I think it's well documented. Cuba just opened up their prisons and say, "Okay, we're going to get you guys out of here." So you got to have somewhat of a screening process, but I think that bar is low. I think, why has the immigration from India been so robust? I think it's because there's a lot of smart and talented people in India. Our IT sector especially is filled with people from India because they're smart people and they're talented. And so from the Latin American countries, they don't have the opportunities for education, so they maybe not have that training, but wow, they're very much a respectful people, and it'd be great to have them. So I've often wondered, we have this huge immigration process that's hard for anybody to comprehend. But it makes me wonder, why don't we have a Ellis Island somewhere down at the southern border, and we screen people? We look for, like Ellis Island, you look for diseases. We don't want tuberculosis coming in. It's not, you screen for that. You look for the criminal element. If they have a criminal past, okay, that's a block. Now, some of that is records. You don't have those type of records in Latin America, but what's the downside to immigration?
Well, particularly in the U.S. And this is a whole nother discussion we could have an episode on, but it has to do with population control. And, 60 years ago, there was a book called Population Boom, which was kind of a scare tactic, if you will, about the overpopulation of the world. And we needed to do something about it. That very year the book was released, the population began to decline. Well, the fertility rate began to decline. In other words, people were not replacing themselves.
And that's a common thing to historically, any nation that has become affluent, the reproduction rates go down for whatever reason. That's a whole nother argument.
Part of it is, when the society changes from agrarian to industrial, you don't need your family to work in the field.
That's right.
And so you have fewer
Your sons
children.
are cheap labor.
Right.
Go out there and mow the yard, son. Go plow the field, son.
So the U.S. Fertility rate is 1.6. So average families having 1.6 children. That doesn't replace ourselves. So we would experience a population decline. However, immigration offsets that for the U.S.
So they say you need to be around 2%.
2.1.
To maintain your population levels. And ideally, you, especially in our Social Security system, which is a glorified pyramid scheme, you want, well, it is, right? I mean, let's call the kettle black.
That's another episode.
Yeah, that's another episode. But Social Security is relying on younger people to pay into Social Security to help the older people retire. That's factual. I don't think that's too confrontational, but we need that population growth. And so I think you come in there and you say, great, and you have people that are willing to work, willing to put in the system. Hey, that's a good thing. You don't want people coming in and milking the system, taking, Americans tend to be generous with their benefits, so you don't want somebody taking advantage of those benefits, but short of that, more the merrier.
Yeah, so let's get back to that after we taste this final offering. And if I didn't mention the export date for these whiskeys, because we're tasting them in order of availability in the U.S., and you can walk into a store and find these. And these three pretty easily. Amrut was made available in the U.S. in 2004, Paul John in 2013, and the one you're holding, Indri, in 2021. So this is the newest expression, newest offering. And this The Indri that we're about to taste is a triple distilled,
Yeah.
which is a distinction of Irish whiskey in particular, but it's also aged in 3 different barrels. It's aged in a bourbon barrel, and then French wine, and then finally sherry. So I would expect more than the other two, certainly more than that Paul John. We're going to taste some sweetness here.
Again, you notice the color, much darker, and I think that's because of the different barrels. 92 proof, just like the Paul John that we just tasted.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't have the same peat. This is more of a spice-eyed style Scotch.
Now, on the nose, I wouldn't be able to distinguish it from bourbon. It has a very sweet odor.
I agree with that. Very, again, very much a full mouth flavor feel to it. It's not the same peat. It goes down without the burn that we had in the Amrut, so it's less alcohol there. Maybe that's why. But I don't taste the same characteristics. Wouldn't expect to taste the same characteristics in the finish as you do with a bourbon. But the finish is a very smooth finish without the acetone titanic finish to it. It's a very nice finish.
Yeah, and I would say this is very fruit forward in terms of its. I'm picking up like oranges and mango. You're right. It's a very full mouthfeel. It's very balanced, and I do detect it's certainly more fruit forward and sweet. I think the sherry and the French wine gives it a different flavor profile than either of the other two, certainly.
Yeah, it's interesting we tasted this third because it's in between the other two. It's not as peaty as the I keep saying John Paul because that's usually an American name. Paul John.
John, Paul, George, and Ringo.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not as peaty as the John Paul. It's more peaty than the Amrut, but it has a much smoother finish than the Amrut. You don't have the smooth finish like you do with Tennessee bourbon, but it's not Tennessee bourbon. It's more of a Scotch style whiskey. It's very good though.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very good. I don't know any other way to say it. It's I would drink this again very happily.
You don't have that charcoal taste to it. You don't have that char taste to it because it's not charred barrels. So it's very much a Scotch.
Yeah, there's a Lux Row offering Davies County, and they have a number of different expressions, and they have one that's a sherry cask aged, and it is reminiscent of that. Reminds me very much of that. So I would say this is almost a between a bourbon and a Scotch. You know, Scotch drinks cleaner, and it does.
So how would you solve the immigration crisis that we have?
Well, a couple of things. One of the things that Trump has really just been raked over the coals about is trying to change the Constitution around natural births in the U.S. Those are protected by the Constitution as being U.S. citizens. The root of what he's doing, though he's not going to be able to change the Constitution. This is not an imperial state. He's not going to be a dictator. The people that thought the 2020 election was stolen really believed he was going to be back in office. It's not going to happen. And in 2028, there will be a new president elected, and in January of 29, there will be a new president installed. So for those that listen that are concerned about a constitutional crisis with Trump's kind of hammer approach, nothing's going to change. But his intent with that component hits somewhat close to home. I have a sister-in-law who's from the DR, the Dominican Republic, and she had a sister who lives there, traveled to Miami, had twins, and went back to the Dominican Republic.
Interesting.
The Constitution was not made for the idea that you could hop on a flight, come over, have babies, and go back. Then, 250 years ago, you had to get on a ship for a very arduous journey. You were pot committed if you were getting on that ship, because you were either going to die in a shipwreck or a sinking, or you were going to make it here and stay.
There's a lot of effort to come.
Exactly. He's trying to eliminate people doing that. There may be another way to do it, but changing the Constitution is not going to be possible. any more than him having a third term. And the congressman I live with, not personally, but my representative, Andy Ogles, who, let me put this tactfully, is he's a Republican, by the way. But let me see, he's an idiot. and I don't know how to put that any more tactfully. He does not need to be in office. I'd like to personally remove him from office, not physically, not advocating violence, but he's terrible. But he's put forth this amendment that Trump could serve a third term, and no, he can't. Constitutionally, no one can serve more than 10 years. Just short of 10 years, and there's a whole rule around that. The theory, going back to what we were talking about before about the replacement rate, is 2.1, and Americans replacing themselves at 1.6. It was theorized that Biden opened the floodgates to make sure there was enough replacement rate available. So bring in the undocumented, let them come, because we need that to establish ourselves from a population standpoint, because some countries, such as China and Japan, have now declining populations. And what is predicted by the year 2100 is that those countries, though they will still exist, will be under the control of someone else who has maintained or expanded their population. Economic power is going to be dictated by an economy that can sustain themselves, and Japan and China are predicted not to be able to do that.
So that's 30,000 foot thinking, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. It's not necessarily wrong. I think, from my point of view, I just think of it more of a simple. If I'm a dad, I'm living somewhere in Latin America. I'm trying to see, the American dream of my kids doing better than myself. I would do whatever I could to better the chances for my children. And so I would like to see a system in which the immigration process, you get here, we'll welcome you with open arms. Exclusions being, okay, you're more of a gang member, maybe, and you're not milking the system, you can, find jobs.
My deal is just use the application process. It's not that prohibitive, is it?
I don't know, but presumably it is. We didn't have the application process back in the day. I think, again, big view, Democrats do a very good job of being empathetic toward immigrants. Republicans do a better job of, hey, we gotta take care of our own poor right now. We have a lot of people in our country that need help, and we don't want to do that at expense of people coming in from foreign countries. But I think there's a halfway in between there, and what that looks like, who knows? But something along the lines of, I don't know, you do a screening process, and then a deferred citizenship process in which you don't get initial benefits. But I would like to see it more of a screen process, more of an Ellis Island approach.
So shockingly, in the 40 minutes we've sat here, we have not solved the problem of immigration.
No, and I don't know that there's a pat answer for it. It's a complex issue, and we're talking about people, we're talking about families, we're talking about individuals, and so it's not a rule from above, thou shalt go do this. Me, we're blessed to have ancestors who came here long ago, and we live in this country in a unique situation. I would like to see that extended to others, but you've got to do that in a responsible way. And what that looks like, it's hard to say.
Now, what we have solved, Jason, is at least for two of these, we would recommend Indian whiskey.
Yes, I would. If you're scared of something strange, don't be scared of it, like Indian whiskeys. Meet your neighbors from other countries, and they have things that you can bring and you can appreciate that you wouldn't otherwise appreciate. I'm enjoying the peated Paul John. I said it correctly this time. I'm enjoying the peated Paul John more than I have peated Isla whiskeys before.
Agreed. Well, thank you guys for joining us today on Two Guys on a Porch, and we'll see you next time.
Take care, and we promise Kimber will talk more next time. Y'all have a great day.
Life is much better with friends, a drink, and cigar, and some Two Guys on a Porch swag.
Let us know what your drink and cigar of choice is at twoguysonaporch.com, and you'll be entered into a drawing to get some Two Guys on a Porch swag